Hi everybody. Today I want to speak to you about two topics within my new book, Emotional Intuition for Peak Performance. Now these two topics I've received actually a lot of feedback about, and a lot of positive feedback about, and a lot of people are actually new to this sort of knowledge, even though they may be interested in Eastern philosophy and spirituality. And these two topics are the disembodied myth and the embodied mind. Now, both relate to two of the fields that I speak a lot about within this book, which is obviously Eastern philosophy, but also cognitive science. And to set the stage, let me read a little bit from my book. Let's have a look if I can even find the page. There it is. And just right at the beginning of the book, I just read this little brief paragraph to set the stage. So cultivating skill and reaching peak performance depends on how we understand the mind and body. This is not some new radical way of thinking. The primary focus of great thinkers throughout history has been on this study, especially of the mind. In both the East and West, understanding human thought and the mind's function has been a central focus. Now, why I read that particular quote to set the stage is because when we look at mind itself, we are talking about one particular aspect of the mind in general, even though we should be talking about it in its complete totality. But when we talk about the mind and understanding the differences between the East and West, when we look at the disembodied myth, this is an aspect of the West, right? The disembodied myth is kind of a philosophical hangover from Plato all the way down to Descartes and Kant. And this is the idea of some sort of abstract rationality. So you're this rational being lugging around this completely irrational body. Now, this is kind of the perspective of most people in the world these days, even in the East, which is very surprising, even though there is still, obviously, the deeply ingrained understanding of a holistic model, which I'll get into in a minute. So you have this disembodied myth where you have this idea of this rational agent lugging around this completely irrational body. Now, one reason for that is because we are identifying in the disembodied myth with one particular region of the brain, which is the prefrontal cortex, to use cold cognitive terms, which is the house of the cold cognition. Now, the cold cognition is what we think of as I. So Jason, I do this, I do that. It's all in just this region of the brain. It's this rational and intellectual sphere that we could say are the cognitive control centers, so to speak, in this prefrontal cortex of the brain. Now, so what's happened, especially since post-Enlightenment Europe and its colonies, is that there's been the Enlightenment period has been focused on rationality. And so that's, obviously that is the primary focus within education and also within society in general. The problem with this is that it's a disembodied psychology. So you have this sense of person which is lugging around this completely irrational body. Edward Slingland actually has a unique way of illustrating this, where he says, when we say, I had to drag myself out of bed this morning. So when you think about that phrase, it's a bit strange, right? I had to drag myself out of bed this morning. Who else but you can get out of bed, unless you're thinking about yourself as separate in some sense from the body. And see, this is kind of subtly ingrained into especially Westerners, but it's happening in the East as well, where we're starting to have this disembodied cognition and disembodied, what I call myth, because we are dissociating ourselves from the body, and it's a disembodied cognition. And so you are primarily focused on just this part of the brain. And so that's where we have this intense feeling of ego, of I. And that's why I mentioned in my other book, Fasting the Mind, about down-regulating tools and methods to down-regulate this, which I actually do talk about in this book as well. A lot more actually in depth, using the tools and the techniques to get over and to start to learn how to down-regulate this, because this can get in the way. What happens is when we over-identify with this, is that leads to all sorts of psychological problems, depression, stress, anxiety, and unfortunately it contributes to suicide, because when you are overloading this sense of I in the prefrontal cortex, when you're overloading the rational aspect of your mind, then that's physiologically expensive. And that's actually been studied in cognitive science. And that is obviously a big problem. When you are constantly overloading this with information and all of the input that goes into the cold cognition, to that rational aspect, then that leads to all sorts of problems and what we would call cognitive overload. And so that's what leads to psychological problems, as I mentioned. And actually, when you're trying to accumulate all this knowledge and trying to download it with this cold cognition, then it's hard to actually remember a lot of that information. And that's why, why I mentioned in this book, actually, why sleep is important. Because if you're just constantly, like a lot of university students, right, they'll stay up late hours and they'll just constantly be feeding themselves information and knowledge, but they don't sleep long enough. And if you don't get enough sleep, a healthy balance between non-rapid eye movement sleep and rapid eye movement sleep, then it's hard to consolidate memories. And so that's why you need healthy sleep to consolidate a lot of the things that you've learned. But why people are not doing so well in university in a sense is because they're trying to cram, and that leads to all sorts of problems. So the disembodied myth, we could technically say, is mind-body dualism. And that's how we actually, in science, that's how scientists have actually been approaching the human instrument for a while now. This idea that the mind and the body are some sort of two different entities, as opposed to being one single brain, so to speak. And this is what brings in actually the Eastern model. And this lends more to the embodied mind, which is the other aspect of my book that people are highly interested in. And when we look at the embodied mind, then we're talking about the other function of the mind, because we're talking about mind-body holism here. See, this is the opposite to mind-body dualism, is mind-body holism. And that is the idea that the mind is embodied, hence embodied cognition or embodied mind. And so what that means is that in the East, even though they didn't have the terminology, right, they didn't have cognitive science, they didn't have cold cognition, they focused on the spontaneous and natural aspect of our mind more so than the intellectual and rational sphere, because of the understanding that we are not this rational being lugging around this irrational body, that this whole body itself is, in a sense, the brain or the mind. There's no separation between mind and body, your toe and your ear. It's a holistic system. And so we have mind-body holism. And so here is more of a focus on the other, like I said, the other function, the hot cognition. And the hot cognition is the spontaneous functioning of the universe, so to speak. So what makes me open and close my hands, allows us to just speak effortlessly any language that we have kind of learned from birth, and just our simple movements of the body. And for example, if you've learned any sort of knowledge that feels effortless for you to bring up, or if you've learned a certain craft that you can just effortlessly perform, then that is the hot cognition in action. That's the spontaneity of life shining through you. But in the East, they're not saying that we should not use our intellectual capacities and that we don't have rationality. But what they are saying is that when we overemploy that, then that's what leads to all sorts of problems, all sorts of psychological problems, and dissociates you in some sense from what we would call the Tao in Taoism or Brahman in Hinduism. It dissociates you from that sense of oneness and your sense of connection to everything and everyone else, and also a deep connection to your own self. It disconnects you from that. So, for example, if you're constantly in the prefrontal cortex and you're constantly viewing reality from that place, from the sense of I as whoever you are and myself as Jason, then we're constantly in the habit of discerning between this and that. And we're cutting reality up like we cut up an apple pie. And we're trying to make sense of it rather than just seeing the pie in its totality. And so that's a big problem with all of us, because that's how we are being educated. And so we're being educated essentially in the wrong way because we're overloading one particular function of the brain. Now, a good way to understand this, the effortlessness of the hot cognition and the embodied mind in unison with the cold cognition, is to understand like music or sport, for example, where if we are a musician, then you need to learn the certain positions of how to hold the instrument. You need to learn music theory, these certain things that eventually become second nature, you see. So you're downloading that into your hot cognition and it becomes second nature. That's why if you're a brilliant violinist, for example, then you can just pick up the violin and just play effortlessly without having to think about it. And usually when you have to think about it, that's when problems occur, because you're thinking about it, and then that blocks you from performing effortlessly, you see. So the analytical mind, which is the prefrontal cortex, gets in the way of the holistic mind, which is the hot cognition. Only when you're overemploying it, keep that in mind. So I explain in the book, the benefits and the flaws of both hot and cold cognition, but the primary focus is on trying to harness this embodied mind, this embodied cognition, where you are essentially only using your cold cognition to a certain degree to learn certain things, but you're not overemploying it majority of your day, because that's what actually brings a lot of trouble to the world and to yourself, because you are cutting the reality up according to how you think it should be, according to whoever you think you are. But who you truly are is everything within this human system, within this instrument. And that's where we have to come back into alignment with the spontaneous nature of ourself within the hot cognition. The reason why it got a bad rap, and the reason why the disembodied myth came about in the first place, was because when people think about hot cognition, or they think about that unconscious region of our mind, they usually equate that to, erratic emotions and some sort of animalistic past that we have had in our evolution. They equate it to that, but it's not true. That's just, again, overthinking. And that's, again, just dwelling in one part, one function of the mind, and trying to exclude the other function. And it can't happen. Keep that in mind. The hot cognition is mainly in control. The spontaneous and natural part of your mind is what is usually operating, even when we are employing the cold cognition. So the embodied mind is where we have essentially down-regulated the cold cognition to only function when it is needed, and allowing the spontaneous virtue of your innate nature to shine forth. And that's what we would call in Taoism, wu wei. That is that effortless action, or what I call in this book, intelligent spontaneity. Or we could say essentially the non-doing aspect of ourselves. Wu wei could be equated to that as well, where you are just acting spontaneously from a place of emptiness. And this also relates to Zen. So the place you want to get to is a mind of no deliberation. That's what the embodied mind is. And in Zen, they try to teach you to act immediately, but also act appropriately. See, when you're acting immediately, but not appropriately, that's when your emotions can be damaging to other people and can incur harm on yourself as well, because you're not present in that situation. You're just kind of just letting your emotions fly, and from where you sit, from whatever is beneficial for you from a primal perspective. And so you want to get out of that. You want to get to the stage of what I talk about in this, about that intelligent spontaneity, when you are acting appropriately and immediately to each and every situation that arises. But you're acting effortlessly, see? It's intelligent but spontaneous. You don't have to think about it. You're already in sync and perfectly calibrated to whatever it is you are doing, you see? I mention a lot about skill and craft in this book, about being perfectly calibrated to the environment with that embodied mind, which allows you to read the terrain perfectly and allows you to perform beautifully. But it also relates to life itself. And that's the key in this book, right? we need to be perfectly calibrated to life itself. We need to have skill in life. We need to be able to navigate and read the terrain of life and be effortless with it. That's the teachings of Zhuangzi, right? The great Taoist sage, is to be perfectly calibrated, but to move effortlessly and not incur any harm on anyone else, and also incur harm on yourself. And so that's the crux really of the disembodied myth and the embodied mind. So you just got to think about mind-body dualism and mind-body holism. And that is a big difference between how the West think about the mind and how the East think about the mind. And it is ironic that cognitive science these days are thinking like the East. They are looking at the structure of the mind and then the two functions of the mind, and they're saying, hold the phone here. What the Easterners were talking about thousands of years ago holds weight here. It has some significance to what we're doing. Though for you and I, because we are students of Eastern philosophy and spirituality, we go, of course. But in the West in general, it's not really accepted because we are holding onto this model of mind-body dualism, where this mind lugs around this completely irrational body. But when you understand mind-body holism and the embodied mind, then you realize that the mind is embodied and the body is mindful. So I hope you all got a lot out of that today. And I know the holiday season is just around the corner, so I hope you all consider going and get yourself a copy of Emotional Intuition for Peak Performance, or it'll be a great gift actually for somebody who you think may benefit from being introduced to Eastern philosophy and spirituality, because this book, even though it goes into some of the deep philosophy and spirituality, it is very practical as well. It gives people the science of meditation and certain exercise methods and the science of sleep and nutrition. There's a lot in this book to get an individual functioning optimally. And so that's one of the big takeaways also from this book. It's not just the deep philosophy, it's also the practicality of it. And that was one of the main reasons I wrote the book, because a lot of people have asked me for many years, how can we take a lot of this Taoist and Buddhist and Hindu knowledge and make it practical in our everyday lives? Well, it's right here. And there's a lot of things that I could talk about in this book, but I won't get into it. But I hope you can consider getting yourself a copy, or a loved one a copy, or a friend. And make sure you hit the like button. The YouTube algorithm seems to like that. A lot of people say to me, how come your content doesn't reach a wider audience? Well, apparently things like hitting the like button and this and that does benefit my content. I don't know if it's true, but that's what they say. And if you enjoy my work and you would like to contribute to my work, please consider heading on over to my Patreon page. The link is in the description. Any small contribution is much appreciated. And I hope you're all doing well out there. And I hope you learned a lot today about the disembodied mind and mind-body holism, or the embodied mind. And I hope that that is going to be a way of thinking for you going forward, instead of thinking of yourself as disembodied from everything else that you are. Shanti, shanti, shanti.